Close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing in a world where giant cockroaches the size of ravens scuttle past your feet, where reptilian monsters with massive sails jutting from their spines hunt through dense forests, and where the air itself feels wrong, thin, hot, suffocating. This isn't some alien planet. This is Earth, your Earth. Just a few 100 million years earlier, most people think Earth's story begins with dinosaurs, but they're wrong. Long before T-Rex ever took its first breath, our planet was home to creatures so bizarre, so alien, that they make Jurassic Park look tame. And then, in what can only be described as Earth's darkest hour, nearly everything died. Not most things, not half, nearly everything. Welcome to the Permian period, the age that time forgot, and the catastrophe that almost ended all life on Earth. Picture Earth's timeline as a book with billions of pages. Humans, we appear in the final paragraph of the last page. Dinosaurs, they show up maybe 20 pages from the end. But the Permian period? That's buried deep in the middle chapters. A story written between 299 and 252 million years ago. A span of nearly 50 million years where our planet transformed from a frozen wasteland into a hellish oven. This era doesn't get the Hollywood treatment. There are no blockbuster movies about Dimetrodon, no children's toys of Lystrosaurus, but make no mistake, this period shaped everything that came after. Every mammal alive today, including you, traces its lineage back to the scrappy survivors of the Permian apocalypse. To understand why this matters, we need to journey back to a world that exists only in fossils and scientific imagination, a world called Pangea. Let's set the stage. If you could somehow step into a time machine and dial it back 299 million years, the Earth you'd land on would be almost unrecognizable. Forget the familiar shapes of Africa, North America, or Asia. Those don't exist yet. Instead, you're greeted by something far more dramatic. A single, massive supercontinent dominating 1/3 of the planet's surface. Pangea. The name literally means all Earth. And it's fitting. Every scrap of land that exists in our modern world was fused together in this colossal landmass. Imagine the combined size of all 7 continents crushed into one sprawling entity, surrounded by an even more massive world ocean called Panthalassa, a body of water so vast it makes our Pacific Ocean look like a pond. The formation of Pangea wasn't gentle. Continents don't just drift together peacefully. They collide with apocalyptic force, crumpling and folding the Earth's crust, thrusting mountains skyward. These continental collisions created some of the most dramatic mountain ranges Earth has ever seen. The ancestors of the Appalachians were born during this violent merger, though back then they would have rivaled the Himalayas in height. But here's where it gets interesting for time travelers. The climate. When the Permian period first kicked off, Earth was shivering through the tail end of an ice age. Massive glaciers gripped the southern portions of Pangea. Temperatures in many regions hovered around a frigid 4 degrees Celsius, about 39 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd need more than a jacket. You'd need survival gear. And the air? It would feel strange in your lungs. Scientists estimate that atmospheric oxygen levels were lower than today's 21%. Possibly as low as 1516% in the early Permian. Not immediately deadly, but enough to leave you winded and gasping after any exertion. Every breath would be a reminder that you're not in Kansas anymore. Yet despite these harsh conditions, life was already stirring. Evolution doesn't wait for ideal circumstances. It seizes every opportunity, no matter how brutal the environment. Fast forward a few million years into the early Permian, and something remarkable is happening. The Ice Age is loosening its grip. Temperatures are climbing. The frozen wasteland is transforming into something greener, more vibrant, more alive. This warming trend unleashed one of evolution's most significant innovations, the first seed-bearing plants, known as gymnosperms. Now, this might not sound exciting to you, but trust me, this was revolutionary. Before gymnosperms, plants relied on spores and needed wet environments to reproduce. They were basically tied to swamps and marshes, imprisoned by their own biology. But seeds changed everything. Seeds were like nature's time capsules, packed with nutrients, protected by tough coatings, capable of surviving droughts and dispersing far from their parent plants. Conifers, cycads, and seed ferns began spreading across Pangaea like a slow-motion green wave, colonizing environments that previous plant life could never touch. These weren't the towering redwoods or pines you might imagine, though. Early Permian forests were dominated by strange, primitive conifers alongside remnants of the great coal swamp forests, massive scale trees and primitive ferns that had ruled the preceding Carboniferous period. As the climate continued to warm and dry, these water-loving giants began their slow extinction, while the adaptable gymnosperms thrived. The transformation of Earth's plant life set the stage for an explosion in animal diversity. New food sources meant new opportunities, and evolution never wastes an opportunity. Now, let's talk about the small stuff. And by small, I mean relatively small, because in the Permian, even insects were supersized nightmares. Wander through an early Permian forest, and you'd hear familiar sounds: the drone of primitive cicadas, the clicking of beetle-like insects crawling over bark, the rustle of countless arthropods going about their business. It would almost feel normal, until you looked down. Scuttling across the forest floor, you'd encounter cockroaches, but these weren't the thumb-sized pests that invade modern kitchens. Permian cockroaches could grow as large as small birds, some species reaching lengths of 3 to 4 inches or more. Imagine a cockroach the size of a sparrow, and you're getting close to reality. Why so big? The answer lies in that atmospheric oxygen I mentioned earlier. While oxygen levels were lower than today by the late Permian, they'd been much higher during the preceding Carboniferous period, sometimes reaching 35%. This oxygen-rich environment had allowed insects to grow to enormous sizes. Though oxygen levels were declining by the Permian, many lineages retained their impressive dimensions. These giant insects weren't just harmless herbivores either. The Permian skies and forests buzzed with predatory insects, massive dragonfly relatives with wingspans that could exceed 2 feet, hunting smaller insects through the canopy. The Permian was a world where being small made you prey, even if you were an insect. But as imposing as these arthropods were, they were nothing compared to what was evolving among the vertebrates. Meet Dimetrodon. If there's one creature that symbolizes the alien strangeness of the Permian, it's this bizarre predator. Many people mistake Dimetrodon for a dinosaur, but that's completely wrong. Dimetrodon lived and died millions of years before the first dinosaur drew breath. In fact, you're more closely related to Dimetrodon than Dimetrodon was to dinosaurs. That's not a typo. Dimetrodon belongs to a group called synapsids, the lineage that would eventually give rise to all mammals, including us. Dinosaurs belong to a completely different evolutionary branch. So when you look at a Dimetrodon, you're essentially looking at your own ancestor's cousin. But what an ancestor! Dimetrodon was a killing machine perfectly adapted to the early Permian world. Growing up to 15 feet in length and weighing as much as 500 pounds, this creature was the undisputed apex predator of its ecosystem. Its most striking feature, that massive sail running down its back, remains one of paleontology's most debated structures. The leading theory suggests the sail was a thermoregulatory device. Remember, Dimetrodon was neither fully cold-blooded nor warm-blooded. It existed in that evolutionary middle ground. The sail, with its network of blood vessels, would have acted like a solar panel in the morning, allowing the animal to warm up quickly by positioning it perpendicular to the sun's rays. Once active in hunting, the increased blood flow through the sail could dump excess heat, preventing overheating. This gave Dimetrodon a crucial advantage. It could become active earlier in the day than its fully cold-blooded prey, essentially getting a head start on hunting while competitors were still sluggish and cold. But the sail served another purpose: intimidation and display. A Dimetrodon approaching with that massive sail fully extended would have been a terrifying sight. And make no mistake, you'd want to run. Dimetrodon's skull reveals a mouth packed with two distinct types of teeth: sharp, blade-like teeth for slashing and tearing flesh, and broader teeth for crushing and grinding. It was a multi-tool of death, capable of processing prey in ways that previous predators couldn't. Imagine encountering one in the wild. You'd see it first from a distance, that distinctive sail cutting through the undergrowth. It would move with a sprawling gait, legs extending out to the sides like a crocodile, body swaying as it walked, not fast by modern standards, but relentless, powerful, and utterly lethal to the smaller creatures of its world. For millions of years, Dimetrodon and its relatives dominated the terrestrial food chain. But evolution never stops, and new players were about to enter the game. As we move into the Middle Permian, roughly 270 million years ago, the world is changing again. Temperatures continue their upward climb, averaging around 25 degrees Celsius, about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Climate is warmer, more stable, and life is responding with explosive diversity. This is when the therapsids make their grand entrance. If you've never heard of therapsids, don't feel bad. Most people haven't. But these creatures represent one of evolution's most important experiments: the bridge between reptiles and mammals. Therapsids were more advanced than their synapsid cousins, like Dimetrodon. They had stronger jaws, more diverse tooth types, and most importantly, a more upright stance. Instead of legs sprawling out to the sides, therapsid legs were positioned more directly beneath their bodies. This seems like a small change, but it's huge. It meant they could move more efficiently, run faster, and sustain activity for longer periods. The therapsids diversified into an amazing array of forms. Take Deuterosaurus, for instance, a hulking beast that could reach 16 feet in length. With its robust build and varied dentition, scientists believe it may have been omnivorous, capable of eating both plants and meat. It was the prehistoric equivalent of a bear, powerful and adaptable. On the other end of the spectrum, you had hunters like Lycaenops, much smaller than Deuterosaurus, only about 3 feet long. Lycaenops was built for speed and precision. Its name means wolf face, and it's fitting. This creature had sharp, interlocking teeth designed for gripping and tearing flesh, long legs for pursuit, and large eye sockets suggesting keen vision for hunting. Lycaenops was essentially a Permian wolf, filling the same ecological niche that canines fill today. The Middle Permian world was a landscape of escalating competition and innovation. Predators grew more sophisticated, which meant prey species had to evolve better defenses or die out. It was an arms race playing out over millions of years, driving both sides toward greater complexity. But the therapsids weren't done evolving. The late Permian would see the emergence of some of the most successful and bizarre creatures of the entire era. Welcome to the late Permian, roughly 260 to 252 million years ago. If you could visit this period, you'd find a world that's simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. The temperatures are hot now, averaging around 28 degrees Celsius, about 84 degrees Fahrenheit. In many inland regions of Pangaea, it's even hotter, approaching desert conditions. This is the age of Lystrosaurus, perhaps the most successful land animal you've never heard of. Lystrosaurus looked like nature couldn't decide between making a pig or a lizard, so it split the difference. About 3 feet long, stocky, with a barrel-shaped body and powerful front legs, this herbivore was built for digging. Why was digging so important? Because Pangaea's interior was becoming increasingly arid. Seasonal droughts were common, and the ability to burrow, to escape the heat, to find moisture underground, to create safe dens, was literally a matter of life and death. Lystrosaurus excavated burrows where it could shelter during the hottest parts of the day, emerging to feed in the cooler mornings and evenings. Despite its ungainly appearance, Lystrosaurus was supremely well adapted to its environment. It had a pair of tusk-like teeth that likely helped it root around for vegetation, and a beak-like mouth perfect for cropping tough, drought-resistant plants. This creature wasn't flashy or terrifying, but it was a survivor, remember that. It becomes important later. Then there were the cynodonts, and these creatures are especially important to our story. Cynodonts look like somebody crossed a large rodent with a mammal, because essentially, that's what they were. These animals, around 3 feet in length, displayed characteristics that we associate with modern mammals. They likely had whiskers for sensory input, more sophisticated teeth for processing food, and possibly even fur or hair-like coverings. Cynodonts were small, shrewd predators and omnivores, feeding on insects, small vertebrates, and probably plant matter when available. They weren't the dominant animals of their time, not by a long shot, but they were adaptable, intelligent for their size, and crucially, they were evolving traits that would later define all mammals. The late Permian oceans, meanwhile, were thriving. As the late Permian progressed, subtle signs of trouble were appearing. Volcanic activity, always a feature of dynamic Earth, was increasing. But this wasn't normal volcanism. Deep beneath Pangaea, particularly in the region that would one day become Siberia, enormous magma chambers were growing, swelling, building pressure. The atmosphere was changing too. Those volcanoes were already belching out greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide. Oxygen levels were dropping, possibly as low as 15% in some estimates. That's roughly half of what we breathe today. For humans, that would mean constant fatigue, inability to sustain any strenuous activity, altitude sickness-like symptoms, even at sea level. The plants and animals of the late Permian had adapted to these conditions over millions of years, but the trend was ominous. Less oxygen meant that fires burned less readily, which affected the spread of forests. It meant that large, active animals had to work harder to fuel their metabolism. It meant that the margin for error was shrinking, and the heat kept building. Pangaea's interior was becoming a pressure cooker. Remember, this was a supercontinent, the largest landmass Earth had seen in hundreds of millions of years. The interior regions were thousands of miles from any moderating ocean influence. Temperatures there could swing wildly between seasons, creating harsh, semi-arid to fully arid conditions. Life was adapting, evolving, persisting, but it was also being pushed to its limits. The late Permian ecosystem was like a tightrope walker, balanced, functional, but one shock away from catastrophe. And that shock was coming, but gradually, life found a way. It always does. The survivors began to diversify, to evolve, to fill the empty niches left by the dead. And from that recovery would eventually emerge a world dominated by new rulers, the dinosaurs. The Permian period stands as both a testament to life's resilience and a warning about its fragility. For 50 million years, our planet hosted ecosystems as complex and magnificent as anything that exists today. Creatures evolved, thrived, and dominated their world. And then, through a combination of volcanic catastrophe and environmental cascade effects, it all nearly ended. The story of the Permian matters because it's our story. Every mammal alive today, every dog, every whale, every human, descends from those synodont survivors that made it through the apocalypse. We exist because a few small, resourceful creatures refused to die when the world was ending. And perhaps there's a lesson in that. The Great Dying was caused by rapid climate change, ocean acidification, habitat destruction, and atmospheric poisoning, problems that sound uncomfortably familiar in our modern world. The Permian reminds us that Earth doesn't care about our existence. It survived worse than us and will outlast us by billions of years. But the species that live on Earth were not so resilient. The Permian shows us what happens when environmental systems collapse. It shows us that there are tipping points beyond which recovery isn't guaranteed. The sail-backed Dimetrodon, the successful Lystrosaurus, the thriving marine ecosystems, all gone now, existing only as fossils and scientific reconstructions. The Permian period was real. These creatures lived, breathed, fought, and died on the same planet you're standing on right now. Their world ended. Ours doesn't have to, but only if we learn from their story.